It all started on a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where residents prided themselves on manicured lawns, freshly painted shutters, and a sense of order that the homeowners association strictly enforced. For years, the neighbors lived in relative peace, occasionally grumbling about the HOA's rules but rarely challenging them outright. Everyone understood the unspoken agreement: follow the rules, and the neighborhood would remain pristine. But beneath the surface of this well-maintained community, tension was building, waiting for a spark. That spark came one summer evening when a resident named Charles Parker decided he had finally had enough. He lived 3 houses down from the cul-de-sac entrance, a 2-story brick home with perfectly trimmed hedges and a driveway he pressure-washed every Saturday. Charles was known for his meticulous habits, the kind of neighbor who noticed everything. And what he noticed that evening as he pulled into his driveway was the sound of music drifting through the air. The music came from the backyard of his neighbor, Ethan Miller. Ethan was a younger resident, a newcomer to the community, who had moved in less than a year ago. Unlike Charles, Ethan wasn't obsessed with perfection. His lawn grew a little uneven at times, his trash bins occasionally sat out overnight, and he often hosted casual gatherings on weekends. Most of the neighbors didn't mind. Some even enjoyed the liveliness he brought to the otherwise quiet street. But for Charles, Ethan represented everything wrong with the decline of neighborhood standards. That night, the music wasn't excessively loud, but Charles fixated on it. He told himself it wasn't about the noise, it was about respect for rules. The HOA had strict guidelines on noise levels, particularly after 9 p.m., and as Charles glanced at his watch, he noted it was already past the cutoff. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and sent a message to the HOA board, a formal complaint about Ethan Miller's late-night noise. What Charles didn't anticipate was that this single complaint would set off a chain reaction far beyond anything he could have imagined. The HOA responded quickly, as they often did with complaints from long-term members like Charles. Ethan received a notice the following week, an official letter taped neatly to his front door. It cited him for a noise violation, warning that repeat offenses could result in fines. Ethan, surprised and annoyed, assumed it was a minor issue that would blow over. He even shrugged it off when he told a friend about it later, laughing about how the neighborhood watchdog must have reported him. But the warning left a mark. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up again. And when the second letter arrived, this time for leaving his trash bins out past pickup day, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was targeting him, and Ethan had a pretty good idea who it was. Charles, meanwhile, felt a strange satisfaction as the HOA began enforcing penalties. To him, this was justice. A reminder that order mattered. But what he didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't the type to accept punishment quietly. The tension grew slowly at first. Ethan became more careful with his gatherings, turning the music down earlier than usual, but the resentment festered beneath the surface. Every time he saw Charles mowing his lawn in rigid, perfect lines or wiping down his spotless garage door, Ethan's frustration deepened. What had started as a petty complaint began to feel like a personal attack. And then came the third violation. This time, the HOA cited Ethan for unauthorized exterior decorations. It was nothing more than a simple string of patio lights he'd hung for an evening get-together. But to Charles, it was yet another infraction that needed reporting. To Ethan, it was proof that Charles was on a mission to make his life miserable. That was the moment when Ethan decided he wasn't going to let Charles win. What began as frustration started morphing into determination, and soon into something darker: revenge. He wasn't going to file counter-complaints or try to play by the rules. Instead, Ethan would hit Charles where it hurt the most: his reputation, his order, his control over the neighborhood. The war between neighbors had officially begun, though neither man could yet imagine how far it would spiral out of control. What started with a single complaint was about to unravel into a community-wide drama, dragging other unsuspecting residents into the chaos and threatening to tear apart the peace of the cul-de-sac. And all of it was only just beginning. The seeds of resentment had already taken root, but it was in the weeks following his third violation notice that Ethan Miller began to water them carefully. Unlike Charles Parker, who thrived on rigid order and open complaints, Ethan believed in subtlety. If Charles wanted to play the game of rules, Ethan would play a different one entirely. He didn't want the HOA to see him as the aggressor. No, his plan was quieter, more deliberate, and far more dangerous. It began innocently enough. Ethan started to adjust his daily habits, not in ways that would break HOA rules but in ways designed to irritate Charles. On Saturday mornings, when Charles was usually out mowing his lawn at exactly 9 a.m., Ethan would begin washing his car just a few minutes earlier, using a portable speaker to play upbeat music. The volume was low enough to avoid another violation but loud enough that Charles could hear it. Then there was the trash. Ethan noticed how obsessively Charles timed his bin placement, setting them out only minutes before pickup and retrieving them immediately after. So, Ethan started placing his own bins just slightly off alignment, nudging them an inch closer to Charles's driveway. It was harmless to anyone else, but to Charles, who valued straight lines and order, it was like a splinter under the skin. Each move was deliberate. Small inconveniences, nothing major. Ethan never pushed hard enough to give Charles reason to file another formal complaint, but the steady drip of annoyance began to wear on him. Neighbors noticed too. They saw Charles's jaw tighten when Ethan waved with a smug smile, or when his spotless driveway had tiny flecks of water overspray from Ethan's car wash. But Ethan wasn't content with mere irritation. He wanted to escalate, slowly pulling the thread that held Charles's composure together. His next move was more strategic. Ethan began befriending other neighbors. He made a point of stopping by during walks, striking up conversations, and offering small favors. He helped one family fix a leaky hose connection, carried groceries for an elderly couple down the street, and even hosted a casual barbecue, inviting everyone except Charles. The exclusion was intentional. As weeks passed, Ethan carefully constructed an image of himself as the friendly, helpful neighbor, the exact opposite of the rigid, critical figure that Charles had become. And as much as Charles tried to assert his influence within the neighborhood, he couldn't ignore the shifting dynamic. People were starting to smile when Ethan waved. They lingered a little longer when he spoke. They accepted his invitations while politely declining Charles's rigidly organized block cleanup days. It was subtle, but Charles felt the change. The neighborhood, his neighborhood, was slipping away from him. Charles tried to push back the only way he knew how, with more complaints. He filed another notice about Ethan's lawn edging, claiming it was uneven. He flagged Ethan's patio lights again, even though they had already been approved in a prior HOA review. But this time, the HOA board wasn't as quick to act. Some members had already started to view Charles as overly nitpicky. After all, they'd seen Ethan helping neighbors, making connections, being part of the community. Who did it really serve to keep punishing him over minor details? Frustrated, Charles attended the next HOA meeting determined to reassert control. He stood up, outlining Ethan's supposed violations in painstaking detail, pointing to photos he had printed out as evidence. But instead of nods of agreement, Charles noticed the uncomfortable shifting in the room. A few neighbors exchanged glances. The HOA president cleared his throat, trying to move the agenda forward. And Ethan, sitting quietly at the back, simply listened with a faint smile. Charles left the meeting seething. For years, his word had carried weight. Now it seemed as though his authority was being questioned. And worse, Ethan was gaining sympathy, weaving himself deeper into the neighborhood's fabric. Ethan recognized his strategy was working, but he wasn't finished. His next step was bolder. He started to craft a narrative, one that painted Charles not just as a complainer, but as a bully. The story spread quietly, whispered in backyards and driveways. How Charles had filed multiple complaints about Ethan for no reason. How he'd once shouted at a neighbor's teenage son for leaving a basketball hoop near the sidewalk. How his obsession with perfection was making life miserable for everyone around him. Ethan never spread these stories directly, but he knew how to plant seeds. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, just enough for others to fill in the blanks. The shift in perception was slow, but it grew undeniable. Charles's once sterling reputation began to tarnish. People no longer saw him as the model neighbor. They saw him as the enforcer, the watchdog, the man who turned small issues into wars. And every time Charles tried to assert himself, He only reinforced the image Ethan was carefully building. Yet Charles wasn't blind. He could see the way things were turning against him. He noticed how neighbors who once waved with enthusiasm now gave polite, distant nods. How fewer people showed up to his organized events, and how laughter seemed to carry more freely from Ethan's backyard than from anywhere else on the street. And beneath it all, a quiet rage simmered. Charles told himself he had been right from the start. Ethan was the problem. Ethan was undermining the rules, breaking down the order that kept the neighborhood perfect. If the HOA wouldn't take action, then Charles would. What he didn't realize was that Ethan had anticipated this exact moment. The subtle retaliation was only the beginning. The real revenge was yet to come. By the time summer gave way to fall, the neighborhood had already begun to divide. Some sided quietly with Charles, still respecting his dedication to rules. But many others drifted toward Ethan, enjoying his easy charm and sense of community. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pull everyone into the conflict, whether they wanted to be involved or not. And as Halloween approached, bringing with it decorations, gatherings, and even more opportunities for rules to be tested, the tension in the cul-de-sac reached a breaking point. Charles was about to make a move that would escalate everything beyond repair. The war of complaints was about to transform into something much darker, much more personal. And once the line was crossed, there would be no going back. Autumn arrived in the neighborhood with a crisp chill in the air and leaves scattered across manicured lawns. For most residents, October meant preparing for Halloween, carving pumpkins, stringing lights, and setting up decorations that transformed the cul-de-sac into a festive landscape. But beneath the cheerful displays of ghosts and jack-o'-lanterns, the simmering tension between Charles Parker and Ethan Miller was about to erupt in ways no one could have predicted. Charles had been waiting for this season. Holidays were his domain. Every year, he meticulously arranged tasteful decorations. A few pumpkins by the steps, a wreath on the door, and precisely measured orange lights outlining his roofline. Subtle, elegant, and exactly within HOA guidelines. For Charles, it wasn't just decoration, it was proof of discipline and control. Ethan, however, had a very different idea of holiday spirit. On Halloween morning, neighbors awoke to find his yard transformed into a full-blown haunted house spectacle. Giant inflatable spiders crawled up his roof, skeletons hung from the trees, and eerie green spotlights bathed the house in an unsettling glow. A fog machine puffed mist across the lawn, while motion-activated ghouls shrieked whenever someone passed. Children were thrilled. Parents chuckled. But Charles was horrified. To him, Ethan's display wasn't festive, it was chaos. It was tacky, disruptive, and most importantly, far outside the bounds of HOA-approved holiday decor. Charles wasted no time drafting another complaint, complete with photographs and citations from the HOA handbook. But when he delivered the evidence at the October board meeting, the reaction wasn't what he expected. The board reviewed his complaint but seemed hesitant. One member noted that the decorations, while elaborate, weren't technically in violation since holiday displays were permitted. Another pointed out how much excitement Ethan's house had generated in the neighborhood. Families were already planning to bring their kids there on Halloween night. The board chose not to act. For Charles, this was the ultimate insult. His authority, once respected, was slipping through his fingers. Ethan wasn't just breaking rules, he was being celebrated for it. The situation came to a head on Halloween night itself. Families filled the cul-de-sac, children running from door to door in costumes, their laughter echoing through the streets. Ethan's house became the center of attention, with a line of eager trick-or-treaters stretching down the sidewalk. He handed out full-sized candy bars, chatted warmly with parents, and basked in the glow of community approval. From across the street, Charles watched with growing fury. His own carefully decorated home received only a fraction of the visitors. He could see parents ushering their children quickly past his yard, their eyes drawn instead to Ethan's spectacle. In that moment, Charles felt invisible in the very community he had spent years shaping. Fueled by resentment, Charles decided to act. Late that night, after the festivities had died down and most neighbors were asleep, he marched across the street with a flashlight and a notepad. He documented every aspect of Ethan's setup, extension cords stretched across the lawn, inflatables staked near the sidewalk, fog machines producing haze into the street. Each detail, he believed, could be twisted into a violation. He planned to present it all to the HOA as undeniable proof that Ethan was reckless and unsafe. But what Charles didn't realize was that Ethan had been expecting this. Hidden among the decorations was a small security camera pointed directly at the yard. When Charles trespassed onto Ethan's property to get closer photos, the camera caught everything. By morning, Ethan had exactly what he needed. The next day, while Charles prepared his formal complaint, Ethan quietly shared the footage with a few trusted neighbors. The video spread quickly, first among families who had enjoyed his haunted house, then through text messages, and eventually onto a private neighborhood social media group. The sight of Charles sneaking across Ethan's lawn at midnight, shining his flashlight and scribbling notes, was met with shock and amusement. For many, it confirmed what Ethan had been hinting at all along. Charles wasn't just a complainer. He was obsessed. He was a busybody who would go to ridiculous lengths to police his neighbors. The nickname, the Watchdog, began circulating, whispered with smirks and laughter. When Charles finally presented his complaint at the next HOA meeting, waving photographs and citing safety concerns, the board members could hardly keep straight faces. Several already knew about the video. Others had seen it themselves. And while no one openly mocked Charles, their dismissive tone stung deeply. His complaint was dismissed as unsubstantiated. That meeting marked a turning point. Charles realized he was losing not just influence but respect. Ethan had outmaneuvered him, turning the community against him with a combination of charm and clever manipulation. But Charles wasn't ready to surrender. In his mind, he was still in the right. The rules were there for a reason. Order mattered. If the HOA refused to enforce discipline, then he would take matters into his own hands. Ethan, however, was already preparing his next move. For him, Halloween had been more than a holiday. It had been a demonstration. He had shown the neighborhood that he could bring joy, while Charles brought only restrictions. The momentum was now firmly on his side. All he had to do was push a little harder, and Charles's carefully constructed reputation would collapse entirely. The conflict had shifted from petty complaints to a battle of public perception. And in this war, Ethan held the advantage. But Charles was growing desperate, and desperation has a way of leading to dangerous choices. As Thanksgiving approached, with another round of decorations, gatherings, and HOA decisions on the horizon, the feud was far from over. In fact, it was only about to grow more vicious. Because Charles, cornered and humiliated, was about to make a choice that would drag the entire community into the conflict. And once the neighborhood took sides, there would be no turning back. By the time November settled over the cul-de-sac, the chill of autumn was matched only by the cold tension between Charles Parker and Ethan Miller. Halloween had left its mark. The memory of Charles sneaking across Ethan's lawn had become neighborhood legend, replayed in whispers and chuckles that seemed to follow him wherever he went. For Charles, every wave from a neighbor felt insincere, every polite smile laced with ridicule. He no longer felt respected, he felt mocked. And nothing infuriated him more than Ethan's growing popularity. Where Charles once held influence through rigid order, Ethan now held sway through warmth and charm. The younger neighbor had positioned himself as the unofficial host of the community, and Thanksgiving offered him another perfect opportunity to solidify that role. Ethan announced he would be hosting a neighborhood potluck the weekend before the holiday. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, cheerful notes handwritten at the bottom inviting families to bring a dish and come hungry. Almost immediately, excitement spread. Parents shared what they planned to cook, kids talked about games in Ethan's backyard, and couples marked the date on their calendars. Charles, of course, received a flyer too. But to him, it was nothing short of an insult. He saw the gathering not as a community event but as a deliberate attempt to undermine him. For years, Charles had been the organizer of seasonal events. His barbecues, block cleanup days, and holiday donation drives had kept the neighborhood united, or so he thought. Now, Ethan was stealing the spotlight, replacing discipline with chaos, order with noise. Determined to reassert control, Charles decided to host his own event, a formal neighborhood dinner scheduled for the exact same evening. His invitations were typed neatly, delivered in sealed envelopes, and outlined the evening's agenda in detail, including seating arrangements and HOA updates. To Charles, this wasn't just a dinner, it was a declaration. A chance to remind the neighborhood of his leadership. When the night came, the divide became painfully clear. Cars lined the street outside Ethan's house, laughter spilling out into the chilly evening air. Tables covered in festive tablecloths filled his driveway, loaded with homemade dishes brought by neighbors. Children played tag under string lights, while parents huddled with cups of cider, smiling and chatting. Ethan moved easily among them, greeting everyone with a grin and making sure no one's plate went empty. Meanwhile, across the street, Charles's house stood quiet. His table was set meticulously with polished silverware and folded napkins, but only a handful of guests arrived. Most were older residents who either respected Charles's past authority or simply disliked noisy gatherings. But the small turnout made the contrast even more glaring. The sounds of joy and conversation from Ethan's event carried easily into Charles's dining room, mocking the stiffness of his nearly silent dinner. For Charles, the humiliation was unbearable. He tried to smile, tried to carry on polite conversation, but every laugh from outside felt like a dagger. He could feel the shift happening, the neighborhood slipping out of his grasp. He had spent years building his reputation, enforcing rules, maintaining standards, and it was all crumbling in the span of a single evening. But humiliation was quickly replaced by anger. To Charles, Ethan wasn't just throwing a party. He was orchestrating a coup, dismantling the very fabric of the community. And Charles decided he would not allow it to continue. The following Monday, Charles drafted his boldest move yet, a formal petition to the HOA to investigate Ethan for repeated violations of community rules. He cited safety hazards from Halloween decorations, noise disturbances from gatherings, and even alleged misuse of common spaces during the Thanksgiving potluck. He sent copies to every board member, pressing for immediate action. But Ethan had been one step ahead. Before Charles's petition could gain traction, Ethan shared a different narrative with the neighborhood. In casual conversations, he mentioned how Charles had refused to attend the potluck, how he had isolated himself and tried to split the community. Neighbors repeated the story, reshaping it with each telling until Charles was no longer seen as a leader but as an outsider, bitter, controlling, and unwilling to adapt. When the HOA board met to discuss Charles's petition, they faced more pushback than ever before. Several residents had already voiced their frustration with Charles's constant complaints. Others praised Ethan's efforts to bring people together. The board, weary of conflict, quietly shelved the petition, citing insufficient evidence. For Charles, it was the final betrayal. The HOA, the very institution he had championed for years, had abandoned him. His authority was gone, his influence shattered. And yet, instead of accepting defeat, Charles's obsession deepened. He began documenting everything Ethan did, every car that parked near his house, every light left on too late, every group of kids who played in his yard. His notebooks filled with observations, times, dates, and photographs. He told himself he was building a case, but in truth, his obsession was consuming him. Neighbors noticed the change. They saw Charles standing at his window late at night, peering through blinds. They noticed his constant muttering during walks, the way he paused too long in front of Ethan's house. Parents began steering their children away from him, whispering that he was becoming strange. Ethan, meanwhile, leaned into his role as the community's favorite. With Christmas around the corner, he promised the biggest holiday light display the cul-de-sac had ever seen. Families buzzed with anticipation, eager to see what he would do next. But Charles saw it differently. To him, the Christmas display wasn't just lights, it was a declaration of war. And this time, he vowed he would not sit quietly while Ethan dismantled everything he stood for. The divide in the neighborhood was now unmistakable. On one side stood Ethan, the charming host who brought laughter and togetherness. On the other stood Charles, the enforcer turned pariah, clinging to rules no one wanted to follow. As December approached, the stage was set for the most explosive confrontation yet. And in Charles's mind, there was no longer room for compromise. If the HOA wouldn't restore order, if his neighbors wouldn't respect the rules, Then he would take matters into his own hands, no matter the cost. The Thanksgiving divide had not just fractured the community. It had pushed Charles past the point of reason. The war was no longer about complaints or violations. It was personal now. And the battle for Christmas would decide everything. December arrived with frost on the lawns and holiday cheer in the air. For most families on the cul-de-sac, it was the most festive season of the year, a time to hang lights, set up trees, and share warm drinks by the fire. But for Charles Parker and Ethan Miller, it was no longer about tradition. It was about dominance. Ethan had promised the neighborhood something spectacular, and he delivered. On the first weekend of December, his house erupted in a dazzling display of holiday lights. Strings of red, green, and gold covered every inch of the roof and windows. A 12-foot inflatable Santa waved from the yard, flanked by reindeer glowing in the night. A synchronized light show pulsed to holiday music, the kind of display that drew cars from other streets to stop and watch. Children squealed in delight, families gathered to take photos, and Ethan stood at the center of it all, the smiling architect of holiday joy. Across the street, Charles watched in silent fury. His own decorations, simple white lights, a wreath, and neatly aligned candles in the windows, looked pitiful in comparison. Where Ethan's house was alive with color and excitement, Charles's looked austere, almost lifeless. To him, it wasn't just about decorations. It was about respect, about control, about the neighborhood slipping into disorder, one garish inflatable at a time. Charles's anger grew with each passing night as cars lined the cul-de-sac to see Ethan's lights. Strangers wandered the sidewalks, taking photos, laughing loudly, leaving footprints on Charles's perfectly trimmed grass. The HOA had rules about holiday displays, but once again, they hesitated to act. Ethan's popularity had given him protection. Complaints were brushed aside as festive spirit. Charles felt abandoned, humiliated, and increasingly desperate. That desperation turned into a plan. If the HOA wouldn't enforce the rules, Charles would. He began documenting Ethan's display in obsessive detail, decibel levels of the music, measurements of extension cords, even photos of visitors' cars blocking driveways. He assembled a thick folder of evidence, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be enough. The board had already dismissed him before. They would do it again. So Charles decided to take matters further. Late one night, when the cul-de-sac was quiet and Ethan's lights were switched off, Charles crept across the street with a pair of garden shears. He told himself it was justified, that cutting a few wires would restore order, that the neighborhood would thank him once the chaos ended. His breath clouded in the cold air as he crouched by Ethan's front bushes, the cords glowing faintly with standby power. He raised the shears, and then the floodlights snapped on. Ethan had been expecting him. A motion-activated camera captured the entire scene, and before Charles could retreat, Ethan himself stepped out onto the porch, phone in hand, recording. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, Charles trembling with rage, Ethan smirking with triumph. Charles muttered something under his breath and fled back to his house, but the damage was done. The evidence was undeniable. By morning, the video was everywhere. Neighbors shared it in group chats, laughing at the sight of Charles sneaking through the yard like a saboteur. Some were angry too. Children had loved the light display, and Charles had tried to ruin it. His reputation, already fragile, collapsed entirely. He wasn't just the watchdog anymore. He was the Grinch. The fallout was swift. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, not to discipline Ethan, but to address Charles's behavior. Trespassing. Attempted vandalism. Violation of community trust. For the first time in years, Charles found himself facing formal consequences. The board voted to fine him, and whispers began about whether he should be removed from certain HOA committees. The humiliation was unbearable. Charles sat in the meeting room, surrounded by neighbors who once respected him, now shaking their heads in disappointment. Every word of criticism felt like salt in a wound. He had tried to protect the neighborhood, and now he was being punished like a criminal. Ethan, on the other hand, emerged as the hero. He played the victim gracefully, speaking about forgiveness and community spirit while subtly reminding everyone of Charles's actions. Neighbors rallied behind him, praising his resilience and generosity. His Christmas lights became a symbol, not just of holiday cheer, but of defiance against Charles's obsession. But humiliation has a way of curdling into something darker. Alone in his house, Charles stewed in silence. The laughter from across the street felt like a taunt. Every car that stopped to admire Ethan's display felt like a personal insult. And every whispered comment from neighbors reminded him that he was no longer respected, no longer feared. The final blow came 2 weeks before Christmas, when Charles overheard his name at the grocery store. A neighbor, speaking to a cashier, joked that Charles should dress up as the Grinch this year. The laughter that followed echoed in his ears all the way home. That night, Charles sat at his desk, staring at the thick folder of notes and photographs he had collected on Ethan. For months, he had documented every detail of his neighbor's life. Now, those notes seemed less like evidence and more like obsession, and yet, he couldn't stop. No longer in control. Because for Charles, this wasn't just about one neighbor anymore. It was about principle, about order, about the belief that without rules, everything would fall apart. And if no one else would defend those rules, then he would, even if it meant burning bridges with every last neighbor on the street. Christmas was approaching fast, and while most families looked forward to celebrations, Charles was planning something else entirely. He told himself it wasn't revenge. It was justice. But deep down, even he knew the line had already been crossed. The Battle of Christmas Lights had exposed him, humiliated him, and stripped him of authority. But Charles wasn't finished. Not yet. The worst was still to come. And when it did, the neighborhood would never be the same again. Christmas Eve arrived draped in snow, the cul-de-sac glowing with lights and the warm hum of celebration. Families moved between houses with plates of cookies and mugs of cocoa, children ran through the streets with scarves trailing behind them, and laughter echoed from every porch. For the neighborhood, it was a picture of holiday cheer. But inside Charles Parker's house, the mood was far from festive. He sat alone in the dim light of his dining room, a single candle flickering against the dark. The sound of Christmas carols drifted faintly from across the street, where Ethan's house pulsed with music and light. It wasn't just a party, it was a spectacle. Neighbors gathered in his driveway, raising cups of cider, taking family photos under the massive inflatable Santa, their joy a living reminder of Charles's failure. Every laugh felt like it was aimed at him. Every cheer, every shout, every burst of applause when the light show synced to music, it was all a mockery. The man who had once controlled the rhythm of the neighborhood now sat forgotten, excluded, and despised. But Charles wasn't ready to be forgotten. He had spent days preparing for this night. His thick folder of evidence lay on the table, neatly stacked. But next to it sat something far more dangerous. A plan, one final act that would prove, beyond any doubt, that Ethan's recklessness was tearing the neighborhood apart. Charles waited until the festivities reached their peak, until he could see Ethan surrounded by neighbors, his arms raised in triumph, his house glowing like a beacon. Then, silently, Charles slipped out into the night. The snow crunched under his boots as he crossed the street, moving with a determination that drowned out any second thoughts. In his hands he carried a small bag filled with tools. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal in his mind, just what he needed to create evidence. Loose extension cords, a few bent nails, scraps of wiring. His plan was simple: scatter them near Ethan's setup, snap a few photos, and present them as proof that Ethan's display was unsafe, a fire hazard waiting to happen. To Charles, it was justice. To anyone else, it would have been sabotage. But as he crouched near the bushes, fumbling with the cords, a shout pierced the air. "Charles? What are you doing?" He froze. A group of children, curious from playing nearby, had spotted him. Their voices carried, and within seconds adults turned, heads swiveling toward the dark figure crouched by Ethan's lights. It was too late to run. The crowd surged forward, confusion rippling into outrage as they recognized him. Ethan pushed through the neighbors, his face lit not with anger, but with something worse: pity. He looked down at Charles, at the bag of wires, at the staged evidence, and shook his head slowly. The murmurs grew louder. Words like sabotage and crazy floated through the air. Phones were raised, recording. The man who had once dictated every detail of their lives now stood exposed, caught in the act of manufacturing chaos. For a moment, Charles tried to defend himself. He stammered about safety, about rules, about how no one cared until it was too late. But his words fell flat. Neighbors weren't listening anymore. They weren't afraid of him, or even angry. They were tired, exhausted by the endless complaints, the accusations, the petty battles that had consumed their community. The HOA board president stepped forward, her voice firm but steady. She told Charles that enough was enough, that his behavior had crossed every line, that after years of disruption, this would be the last straw. The board would move to strip him of his HOA privileges, ban him from enforcement roles, and fine him for harassment. Charles stood in the snow, surrounded by flashing lights and cold stares, his world collapsing around him. For years, he had built his identity on power, on being the enforcer, the watchdog. And now, in the span of minutes, it was gone. The final blow came when Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, not in anger, but in quiet sympathy. He told Charles that he didn't need to fight anymore, that the neighborhood didn't need an enemy, that maybe what Charles needed most was to let go. But Charles couldn't hear it. His pride, his obsession, his need for control, all of it had hardened too much. In his eyes, Ethan wasn't offering peace. He was offering defeat. Without another word, Charles turned and walked back to his house. The snow swallowed his footsteps, the whispers of neighbors following him like shadows. He didn't return to the party, didn't defend himself further. He simply vanished into the silence of his home, leaving Ethan and the others to wonder what he might do next. That night, the neighborhood celebrated late into the evening, but there was an unease beneath the joy. The image of Charles, crouched in the snow with a bag of wires, lingered in everyone's mind. They had seen the breaking point, the unraveling of a man consumed by revenge. In the weeks that followed, Charles withdrew completely. He stopped attending HOA meetings. His carefully manicured lawn grew untended. Curtains stayed drawn, lights rarely flickered on. Some neighbors whispered that he had moved away, though no one ever saw a moving truck. Others believed he was still inside, watching, waiting, his obsession smoldering in the dark. Ethan, meanwhile, became the undeniable heart of the community. His parties grew, his reputation soared, and the neighborhood flourished under a new sense of unity. But every so often, when the music quieted and the laughter faded, he would glance across the street at the darkened windows of Charles's house. And in those moments, he wondered, was the feud truly over? Or had Charles Parker simply stepped back, biding his time, waiting for the day he could strike again? Because revenge, once ignited, is rarely extinguished. And in that quiet cul-de-sac, where Christmas lights once sparked chaos, the shadow of one man's obsession still lingered, an unspoken reminder of how quickly a single complaint can spiral into something much darker. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.